what if the worst thing that's ever happened to you is also the most necessary? What if this darkness you're drowning in is actually the womb where something truer is being born? There comes a moment, perhaps you're living in it right now, when everything you thought you knew collapses. The life you built no longer fits. The person you pretended to be can no longer breathe inside the armor you've worn for so long. You wake at 3 a.m. with a question burning in your chest. Who am I? Not what I do, not what I've achieved, not the roles I perform or the faces I show the world, but who am I truly, in the depths where no one else can see, where I can barely see myself. If you're an introspective soul in crisis, someone who questions everything, who can't settle for easy answers, perhaps one of those deep intuitive minds, INFJ, INTJ, INFP, or INTP. This question doesn't just visit you, it devours you. It follows you through crowded rooms where you feel utterly alone. It whispers in the silence after conversations that never touch what matters. You are the ones who cannot stop seeing beneath the surface, who sense the patterns everyone else ignores, who feel the weight of invisible threads connecting everything, and wonder why no one else seems to notice, and it exhausts you. You've spent your life searching, connecting dots that others don't see, asking questions that make people uncomfortable, watching how everyone else seems to move through life with such certainty, such ease, and wondering, have they found something? Do they know something I don't? Is there a way to live that doesn't feel like drowning in meaning while starving for it? You look at their smiles, their routines, their contentment with surfaces, and you ask, did they find the answer? Or did they just stop asking the question? And here you are, maybe at the edge of breakdown, maybe in the aftermath of loss, maybe just tired of pretending, wondering if this hunger will ever end. But what if I told you that everything you think is wrong with you is actually the beginning of something else? What if the meaning you've searched for in every philosophy, every person's eyes, every moment of connection that dissolved too quickly, what if it was never hiding somewhere else? What if meaning isn't something to find at all, but something you create through the very act of refusing to settle for easy answers? What if your crisis is not a breakdown, but a breaking open? Humanity has always known this pain, this feeling of being lost in your own life, of searching for something you can't name. Ancient mystics went mad trying to articulate it. Poets died with it still burning in their throats. At the beginning of the 20th century, a Swiss psychiatrist, Carl Jung, found himself in his own crisis. Not an academic question, but a genuine descent into the underworld of his own psyche. He nearly lost himself completely. What he brought back changed everything. Jung was more than a scientist. He was a survivor of the very journey he would spend his life mapping. He walked through the darkness and returned with a map, not to avoid the darkness, but to navigate it consciously. For Jung, the life of the psyche is not a comfortable theory. It is a living crisis, a necessary upheaval, a death and rebirth that cannot be bypassed. It is a journey, often unwanted, always transformative, toward a self you don't yet know. A path through shadows and light, through loss and terrible renewal, through the shattering of every illusion, through valleys where you lose even the memory of who you were. This journey, Jung called it, the process of individuation. Nobody chooses it. It chooses you, through breakdown, through loss that strips everything away, through the moment when your carefully constructed life reveals itself as a prison, through the question that wakes you at night and won't let you sleep, and once it begins, there is no going back to who you were. For those of you who live with intuition burning like a flame you cannot extinguish, who see what others refuse to see, who feel the weight of consciousness itself, this journey may be the only thing that will save you, not from the pain, but from living a life that was never yours. This journey will take you through the landscapes Jung mapped, the ego that thinks it controls everything, the shadow you've been fleeing, the masks you've worn so long you forgot your face, the roles that no longer fit, the war between opposites tearing you apart, and finally, the self, the quiet center you've been searching for everywhere but within. Ready? Let's begin with the ego. Stay with me. The beginning, the ego and its illusions. You think you know yourself. You've built an identity, made choices, created a life. You have opinions, preferences, a sense of I that seems solid, real, unquestionable. This is the ego, the conscious I that believes it's steering the ship, that thinks it understands what it wants and why. And right now, your ego might be terrified, because something is happening that it cannot control. Something is rising from depths you didn't know existed. The ego is necessary. Without it, you would be lost, unable to function, unable to say this is me, and that is not me. It's the part of you that got you through school, through relationships, through all the performances required by life. But the ego is only a small island of consciousness, surrounded by a vast, dark ocean, the unconscious. And right now, in this crisis, in this breaking open, the ocean is rising. The waves are crashing over your carefully built shores. Everything you thought was solid ground is revealed to be sand. You thought the island was all there was. You built your entire life on that assumption, but beneath the surface, forces have been at work that you never acknowledged. Memories you've buried so deep you've forgotten they exist. Desires you've strangled because they didn't fit the person you needed to be. Wounds that never healed, but only calcified into your personality. The ego lives in daylight, in the realm of what can be named and controlled. The unconscious lives in perpetual twilight, where time collapses, where your past is still happening, where symbols speak truths your conscious mind refuses to hear. And in these depths dwells what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is everything you've had to exile to survive. The anger you learned was unacceptable. The needs you were taught were shameful. The parts of yourself that didn't fit the mold. The desires that contradicted the person you were supposed to become. It is the part of you that you've been running from your entire life. And now, in this crisis, it's catching up. The shadow is not your enemy. It is not evil or wrong or something to destroy. It is simply everything you had to disown to be loved, to be accepted, to survive in a world that demanded you be smaller than you are. But what you exile doesn't disappear. It waits in the dark, growing stronger, and eventually it demands to be seen. To ignore the shadow is to be possessed by it, to find yourself doing things you swore you'd never do, becoming the very thing you judged in others, sabotaging the life you're trying to build with a force that seems to come from nowhere. But to recognize it, to turn and face what you've been fleeing, this is where freedom begins. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the truth your crisis is trying to teach you. You cannot heal by pretending to be only light. You cannot become whole by cutting away the parts of yourself that frighten you. The path forward, the only path, leads directly through what you've been avoiding. The door to who you might become passes first through who you've refused to be. The mask you can no longer wear, the persona. Before you can face your shadow, you must first see something even more painful. The life you've been living might not be yours at all. The persona, the mask you wear, starts innocently enough. You learn what makes people smile, what earns approval, what keeps you safe. You become the good child, the responsible one, the successful professional, the person who never causes trouble. And somewhere along the way, you forget you're wearing a mask. You achieve everything you were supposed to want. You check all the boxes. You build the career, maintain the relationships, present the image of someone who has it together. But inside, you're dying. You smile when you want to scream. You nod when you want to run. You perform competence when you feel like an imposter. You maintain the facade while something essential in you slowly suffocates. Maybe you've been doing this for so long you don't even know what your real face looks like anymore. The mask has fused to your skin. You've forgotten where the performance ends and you begin, and then something breaks. A failure you can't hide. A loss you can't explain away. A moment when the mask slips and you catch a glimpse of the stranger you've become. Or maybe just the slow, creeping realization that you're living someone else's life, following someone else's script, dying by inches while everyone congratulates you on your success. This is the crisis the persona creates. The moment when you realize you've been an actor in your own life, that you've spent years, maybe decades, being who you thought you had to be instead of who you are. And now the mask is cracking. This feels like collapse, like failure, like everything you've worked for is revealed as meaningless. But Jung understood it differently. This breaking of the persona is not the end. It's an invitation. It's your psyche refusing to let you die while still breathing. The crack in the mask is where the light gets in, or perhaps where the darkness finally gets to speak. Either way, it's where truth begins. You cannot become whole while wearing a false face. You cannot heal while pretending. You cannot find yourself while performing someone else's life. The crisis is not that the mask is breaking, the crisis was living behind it for so long. The roles you've been playing when the script no longer fits. When consciousness cracks open, the unconscious begins to speak. And one of the first things it reveals is this: you've been playing roles that aren't yours. The hero who saves everyone else while neglecting their own wounds. Always rescuing, always fixing, always carrying others' burdens, until you collapse under the weight and wonder why no one saves you. The martyr who sacrifices endlessly, who gives until there's nothing left, who wears exhaustion like a badge of honor. You thought this was love, but it was self-abandonment dressed as virtue. The wise one who always has answers for others but can't solve their own life. You guide, you counsel, you see clearly into everyone's soul except your own. The rebel who defines themselves by opposition, who knows what they're against but not what they're for. You've been running from something for so long, you've forgotten what you're running toward. These are archetypes, not abstract concepts, but patterns you're living right now. Jung discovered that we unconsciously adopt these ancient roles, these universal scripts, and they work for a while. They get us through. They give us identity, purpose, a way to make sense of ourselves, until they don't. Until the hero realizes they're dying trying to save a world that doesn't want saving, and finally turns inward to save themselves, to save the self, to rebel against the predefined social script and become conscious, until the martyr understands that sacrifice without self-respect is just slow suicide, and chooses to honor their own needs as sacred, until the wise one admits they're lost too, and discovers that true wisdom begins with not knowing, until the rebel realizes that defining yourself by opposition is still letting others control your story, and finds the courage to stand for something, not just against everything. Your crisis is the moment these roles stop working. The script you've been following, the one you learned from family, from culture, from the wounds that shaped you, it no longer fits. You can't perform it anymore. You've outgrown it, or it's killing you, or both. The unconscious is trying to tell you something through your breakdown. These roles were never who you truly are. They were survival strategies. Masks you wore to navigate a world that demanded you be someone manageable, predictable, safe. But now the mask is suffocating you. Jung understood that these patterns, these archetypal roles we play, move through our lives whether we're conscious of them or not. The only question is, will you keep unconsciously acting them out, or will you face them, understand them, and choose something truer? The unconscious speaks through your symptoms, your dreams, your repeated patterns. It's been trying to wake you up, and your crisis is its loudest call yet. The sacred union, Anima and Animus. At the core of this inner dialogue, Jung discovered a fundamental polarity. He called it the Anima and the Animus. In every man, Jung saw an anima, an inner feminine soul image, the source of his depth, his feeling, his capacity to be moved by beauty, to surrender to mystery, to create, to connect. In every woman, he saw an animus, an inner masculine soul image, the source of her clarity, her conviction, her capacity to think decisively, to act with strength, to stand firm in her truth. This was Jung's traditional framework, and it opened a door to understanding the inner life. But if we go deeper, behind the cultural language of Jung's time, beneath the categories of masculine and feminine, we find something even more universal, something that applies to every human soul regardless of gender. These forces aren't really about being male or female. They're about opposing principles within you, two ways of being that are at war inside your psyche right now. Part of you wants to be strong, decisive, in control, the warrior, the strategist, the one who never breaks. This is the voice that says, don't feel, just act. Don't cry, just solve it. Don't be vulnerable, be competent. But another part of you is drowning in feeling. This is the part that wants to surrender, to be held, to stop performing strength and just admit you're scared, exhausted, lost. The part that knows thinking isn't enough, that some truths can only be felt. These two parts are at war inside you, and you've been trying to kill one to save the other. Maybe you've been all logic, all control, all competence, and now you're collapsing under the weight of emotions you've ignored for years. Your body is screaming what your mind refused to acknowledge. Or maybe you've been all feeling, all empathy, all sensitivity, drowning in everyone's pain, including your own, unable to think clearly, unable to set boundaries, unable to act decisively when you need to. And here's what's destroying you. You've been projecting one of these forces onto other people. You fall in love with someone who seems to carry the strength you can't access, or the softness you've denied, or the clarity you lack. You think they complete you. You think if you can just have them, merge with them, you'll finally be whole. But they're not your savior. They're a mirror showing you what you've refused to integrate within yourself. Every relationship that's broken you, every person who disappointed you, every time you thought they had something I needed, it wasn't about them. It was about the part of yourself you'd exiled, the capacity you'd denied, the opposite you'd refused to embrace. Individuation means bringing these warring parts home, not choosing thinking over feeling or feeling over thinking, not becoming purely strong or purely soft, but holding both, becoming large enough to contain your own contradictions. This is brutal work. It means the one who's been all logic must learn to cry, to not have answers, to sit in uncertainty without trying to solve it. It means the one who's been all feeling must learn to think clearly even when emotions are screaming, to act even when it's uncomfortable, to stand firm even when it means disappointing someone. You must become what you've been running from. And when these opposites finally stop fighting and start talking, when the warrior learns to weep and the empath learns to set boundaries, something shifts. The war ends, not because one side won, but because you became large enough to hold them both. Jung called this the sacred marriage, the union of opposites within. Not a wedding in the outer world, but an inner reconciliation of what was divided. That's when the deeper intelligence awakens. That's when you stop searching for completion in another person and find it in the wholeness of your own being. If these words are landing somewhere deep inside you, if you're recognizing yourself in this struggle, in this hunger, in this refusal to keep pretending, you're not alone in this. Subscribe to continue this journey together, to explore what it means to face your shadow, to integrate your contradictions, to become whole instead of perfect, because this path is too difficult to walk alone. The self, when you realize you are never in control. Jung compared the psyche to a circle. At its center lies the self. And here is where everything you believed about yourself falls apart completely. The self is not the ego. The ego is that small, frightened voice in your head that thinks it's running your life, desperately trying to hold everything together, to maintain control, to figure it all out. But the self is something else entirely. Vaster, older, stranger. It is the totality, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, everything you've been and everything you're becoming. If the ego is a candle flame struggling in the wind, the self is the sun, the true center around which everything revolves, whether the ego knows it or not. And here's the truth that might terrify you or liberate you. The ego has never been in control. You thought you were steering your life, making your choices, determining your path. But then life happened, the crisis, the loss, the breakdown, and you realized you were never in control of anything. Something larger has always been at work. Jung called this larger force the self, and its unconscious depths have been speaking through your dreams when your conscious mind refuses to listen, through your symptoms when you won't slow down, through your suffering when you need to change. Individuation is this moment, right now perhaps, when the ego finally surrenders its illusion of sovereignty. It was never the king. It was always the servant of something deeper, wiser, more whole. This is a death, the death of who you thought you were, the death of the belief that you can think your way out of this, control your way through it, manage yourself back to stability. But it is also a birth into a different relationship with yourself and with life. A humility that is not weakness but truth, a trust earned through surviving what you couldn't control. You return to the world differently, no longer in constant reaction, desperately managing every outcome. Instead, in relation, in dialogue with something larger than your fear, no longer driven by unconscious compulsion, but guided by a deeper purpose, a sense of what wants to be born through you. For those of you who navigate by intuition, who trust invisible currents more than visible shores, this might be what you've been searching for without knowing it. The meaning you sought everywhere else was never separate from you. It was always being created through you, woven into being by your questions, your crisis, your refusal to accept a life that doesn't fit your soul. The dots you've been connecting weren't leading to a final answer. They were creating a constellation. Your constellation, the unique pattern of your becoming, the meaning that could only be made by you, through you, as you. You weren't searching for the path, you were becoming it. The trials of the path. When you think you failed, you thought you were getting better. You had that breakthrough, that moment of clarity where everything made sense. You saw your shadow, you named it, you thought you'd integrated it. You felt the mask crack open. You understood the roles you'd been playing. You felt whole, finally. And then, you wake up one day and you're right back where you started. The rage you thought you'd faced, it's back, possessing you in a moment of stress. The mask you thought you'd removed, you're wearing it again, performing for approval like nothing changed. The pattern you swore you'd broken, you just repeated it with someone new. And you think, I've learned nothing. I'm not progressing. I'm failing at this. Maybe I'm not capable of change. Maybe this is just who I am. This is the most brutal part of the path. Not the initial crisis, but the return. The moment when you realize this isn't a linear journey with a clear destination. It's a spiral. You keep meeting the same demons, the same wounds, the same patterns, just at different levels. But here's what you can't see in that moment of despair. You're not back where you started. You're meeting the same challenge differently. Last time, you were unconscious, possessed by the shadow, controlled by the mask, acting out the pattern without even knowing it. This time, you see it happening. Maybe you can't stop it yet, but you're aware. And that awareness, that tiny sliver of consciousness, changes everything. Each cycle brings you deeper. The first time you meet your anger, you just act it out. The second time, you recognize it afterward. The third time, you catch it in the moment. The fourth time, you feel it rising and make a different choice. This is the slow alchemy Jung spoke of. Not dramatic transformation, but gradual refinement. The raw, broken parts of you being worked on again and again, patiently, stubbornly, until something shifts. Your crisis right now, this depression, this meaninglessness, this feeling that nothing matters, this is not random suffering. This is the forge. This is where the soul does its deepest work, in the dark, when you think nothing is happening. This transformation rarely happens in theory. It happens in life itself, in the relationships that challenge you, in the pain that cracks you open, in the silences where you finally hear yourself, in the ordinary days that ask you to show up fully. It happens when you're exhausted and want to give up, but don't. When you catch yourself mid-pattern and make a different choice. When you sit with the discomfort instead of numbing it. When you apologize for something you would have defended before. When you set a boundary you've never set. These small moments, they're the work, not the big epiphanies. The tiny, unglamorous choices made in the middle of your messy, imperfect life. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this becoming is not easy. It costs you everything you thought you were, everything you thought you needed to be. And in return, it gives you yourself. Becoming whole, not fixed, but real. At the end of this journey, if there is an end, if you ever stop becoming, you realize something that might break your heart and heal it at the same time. The goal was never to be perfect. It was to be whole. And wholeness means accepting that you will never be fixed, never be complete, never arrive at a place where you have it all figured out, where you've eliminated every flaw, where you can finally stop struggling and just be okay. Perfection was the ego's fantasy, the belief that if you could just become good enough, strong enough, wise enough, you could finally stop feeling this pain, this hunger, this sense of incompleteness. But wholeness is something else entirely. Wholeness means standing in the center of your contradictions and no longer trying to resolve them, carrying both your light and your darkness, being both strong and broken, wise and confused, healed and still wounded. It means welcoming every part of yourself, even the parts that still hurt, even the parts that still fail, even the parts that still carry shame and fear and doubt, especially those parts, because they're not obstacles to who you could become. They're part of who you are. To be whole is to stop being at war with yourself, to stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts, to stop performing an edited version of your humanity. It's to stand, trembling, imperfect, still uncertain, and say, "This is me, all of it. The parts that shine and the parts that stumble, the moments of clarity and the moments of confusion, the times I rise and the times I fall. This is me, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Jung said, "What we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate." Your crisis, this breakdown, this dark night, this moment when everything fell apart, it came because something in you refused to stay unconscious anymore. Something in you chose truth over comfort, chose becoming over pretending. And now you have a choice: to make conscious what has been haunting you from the shadows, or to let it continue to run your life from behind the scenes. To become whole is to take responsibility for your own story, not to blame yourself for everything that happened, but to recognize that you are not just a victim of circumstance. You are a participant in your own becoming. It's to say yes to what life is asking you to learn, even when it's painful, even when it requires you to change everything, even when it means letting go of who you thought you had to be. And in that yes, something opens, a space where peace is no longer the absence of struggle, but the acceptance of it, where wholeness is no longer about having it all together, but about being real. This wholeness doesn't make life easy. You'll still feel pain, maybe even more deeply than before, because you're no longer numb. You'll still face challenges, but you won't collapse under them the way you once did. You'll still meet your shadow, but you won't be possessed by it, won't be unconsciously acting it out. You become larger than any single part of yourself, large enough to hold the contradictions, large enough to contain both the wound and the healing, large enough to be human, imperfect, and alive. And in that largeness, you discover something unexpected, a capacity for joy that doesn't depend on everything being okay, a groundedness that holds even when everything is shaking. A quiet sense that you are exactly where you need to be, even if it's not where you wanted to be. The hunger that drove you to search everywhere for answers, through books that promised enlightenment, through watching others and wondering what they knew that you didn't. That hunger was never a flaw. It was your soul refusing to settle for a life that wasn't true. It was consciousness itself demanding to be born through you. Your life is calling you. Maybe you're listening to this in the middle of the night when sleep won't come and the questions won't stop. Maybe you're listening after a loss that took everything you thought you knew about yourself. Maybe you're listening because you can't keep pretending anymore and you don't know what else to do. Individuation has no end. It's not a destination you reach where everything finally makes sense. It's a continuous breaking open, a perpetual becoming, the breathing of the soul itself. You'll never arrive at a place where you're finished, where you've figured it all out, where you can finally rest in certainty. And maybe, just maybe, that's not the tragedy you think it is. Maybe it's the only way to stay alive. Each time a human being stops running and turns to face what's been chasing them, the world becomes a little more conscious. Each time someone chooses truth over comfort, depth over surface, becoming over pretending, something shifts. This journey toward yourself is not selfish, it's not self-indulgent, it's not navel-gazing while the world burns. It's the most necessary work there is, because you cannot show up for anyone else. Not really, not truthfully, until you've shown up for yourself. You cannot hold space for another's pain while you're fleeing from your own. You cannot love without projection until you've faced what's inside you. By becoming more whole, not perfect but real, you become more human, more capable of genuine presence, more able to bear witness to what is, rather than what you wish it would be. You stop living reactively, controlled by wounds you don't understand. You start living responsively, guided by something deeper than fear. And maybe that's the meaning of this life, not to escape what we are, but to finally, fully, courageously inhabit it. Not to transcend our humanity, but to dive so deeply into it that we find something sacred there. Jung walked this path himself. He descended into his own underworld and barely made it back. What he brought back was not a system to memorize or a theory to understand. It was an invitation to stop running, to turn and face yourself, to make conscious what has been unconscious, to become who you already are beneath all the fear and pretending. And right now, in this moment, your life is calling you. Not the life you thought you should have, not the person you thought you should become, but the life that's actually yours, raw, imperfect, uncertain, and more real than anything you've known. To you, the deep intuitive, the one who sees too much and feels too deeply, the one who connects dots others don't see and asks questions that make people uncomfortable, this journey is not optional anymore. It's chosen you. Subscribe to Walk This Path Together to explore what it means to stop performing and start living, to discover what waits on the other side of your crisis. You are exactly where you need to be, exhausted, uncertain, still afraid, but no longer able to turn away. The life you've been searching for is not somewhere else. It's here, in this breaking open, in this crisis, in this moment when everything you thought you knew falls away and something truer tries to emerge. This is not the end, it's the beginning. Will you answer the call?